Well, no, it's a great pleasure this morning to introduce two of our speakers. Professor Chris Isham has been Professor of Theoretical Physics at Imperial College London for, I think, a quarter of a century, something like that, is it?
Almost 45 years.
Almost 45 years.
Not really.
And he's worked in quantum gravity, made many significant contributions in that area. More recently, he has been involved in fundamental questions to do with quantum theory, and we'll be hearing a bit more about that later on. He's also contributed and edited some of the volumes that have been sponsored by the Vatican Observatory and the Centre for Theology and the Natural Sciences in Berkeley. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to get hold of this in the book stall. This is my personal copy, but if anyone wants to browse, do. This is Quantum Cosmology and the Laws of Nature, Scientific Perspectives on Divine Action, which Chris is one of the editors of. And indeed, there's a summary of this debate that we'll hear this morning, actually.
Go read the book.
John Polkinghorne, I think in the science and religion area, needs almost no introduction. He was Professor of Mathematical Physics here in Cambridge. He resigned his chair to take holy orders in the Church of England, and since then has held parish posts, and then came back to Cambridge as Dean of Trinity Hall, President of Queen's College. He's written numerous books, and I see that some of you have already got autographed copies. We do have quite a number of John's books on the bookstall. He has therefore written widely. He's a Templeton Prize winner, a major figure in the science-religion debate. So it's a pleasure to have now a dialogue on the question, can God know the future? Reflections on a block universe. I think Chris is going to kick us off.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm not going to talk about God, I leave that to John. John and I have had this debate before. The question at stake really is this, that the block universe refers to an interpretation, if you like, of some of the basic ideas in modern physics, which views space and time as a single entity. Now, if you adopt this view, you're inclined to say that the concept of now and so on is illusory, and the whole thing really is just a single entity. John is a very keen defender of process theology, I think that's fair to say. Process ideas, anyway.
The notion of process, not a process theology.
Okay, process ideas. So it's only process ideas, which is the exact opposite. Now, I said we've had this discussion before. It's not actually I particularly disagree with John. I never have done. It's more for the sake of a debate, but I'm going to take the opposite point of view, which is to present you the ideas about the block universe. Now, I must say, it's never been totally clear to me whether we're talking about a genuine difference in matter of fact, as it were, or just a different philosophical interpretation of essentially the same thing. I think John would say there's an actual difference. I think, I'm not, maybe he's right, I'm just not so sure about that. What is true is that if you look at the purely mathematical structures that we do use in modern theoretical physics, some of them at least do lean towards or tend to suggest a block view. On the other hand, others actually suggest the opposite, so it's not like there's any sort of definitive statement about this. So what I'm going to do in my half of this presentation is to talk about, just very elementary, mind you really, because most of you are physicists, I think, of the basic equations, and point out how they tend to be interpreted, or when they can be interpreted in a block way, and then John will sort of develop the other side of things. Okay, so let me start off then with okay, so you see, started off by saying it's two different space-time interpretational schemes. I said I think John wouldn't totally agree with that. I'm not sure I do myself, but anyway, we'll see. So if you look at what we actually do in modern theoretical physics, as far as this particular issue is concerned, you can conveniently break it down into four different subjects. So there's Newtonian physics, both classical and quantum. There's special relativity, both classical and quantum. There's general relativity, both classical and quantum. And there's quantum cosmology, which, if you like, is you can think of as a sub-branch of quantum general relativity, but has certain special ingredients of its own. Now, in all of these subjects, this issue arises about the nature of time and space. Right? It occurs in all of them, but in somewhat different ways. Now, actually, you see the word God does appear once in transparencies. There's this question I'm not really quite clear about, actually, is at what scale are we talking? Because the thing that, as indeed I emphasised last night, the thing about physics is it has, because it comes with scales, and this is why we can do it in the sense that we focus on a certain scale of understanding, and we know perfectly well the theory doesn't work outside that scale, and that's how various things come about. So when we talk about God's concept of the future, are we talking astronomical scales, or L scales, a few meters, atomic scale, which is 10 to the minus 10 meters, nuclear scale, 10 to the minus 16, or the quantum gravity scale, which is 10 to the minus 35 meters? Now, most people who work in quantum gravity, whether they're string theorists or anything else, would agree that probably our notions of space and time break down completely at 10 to the minus 35 meters. So this debate would be quite pointless there. But I think, I myself think it's also not irrelevant. I don't know what God does at 10 to the minus 35 meters. Actually, John, maybe you can tell me that answer sometime. When you're speaking. I'm just often intrigued by that. Anyway, so that's the sort of thing we have to think about, all of those subjects potentially. But let me start off with classical Newtonian physics, because that's the easiest. Now, personally, I think Newtonian physics is completely neutral about the issue of block or not block. So, first you start off with, actually I said everyone here is a physicist. The organisers told me that's true, but it's probably false. Can I ask who's not a physicist or mathematician or something? Oh, you see, I was misled. Okay. Well, in that case you're going to really, okay, my lecture this afternoon is going to be, anyway. Okay. Well, there we have Newton's equations. Okay, so they say that mass times acceleration equals force. And the d2x by dt squared then says the rate of change of some position in time. Now, that's a mathematical equation, right? And it describes fundamentally Newtonian physics. It is only a mathematical equation. That's all at the moment. From a mathematical point of view, we know that there's a unique solution provided you specify at some initial time the position x and the velocity, and then we know there's a unique solution. There are, of course, considerations of chaos, but set those aside. Now, as far as this mathematics is concerned, there clearly is no concept of now. I mean, mathematicians don't know about now. It's simply a mathematical equation. It tells you nothing whatsoever. If you look at the solution, if you plot it like this, so I've plotted here space against time, so some particle moving in one dimension, and so it's just moving along this axis, and here it's going a bit faster and it slows down, it's a bit slower, and so on. Now, it is certainly true that you can discuss this in terms of the history of the whole thing. And some people, defenders of the block universe, probably say you should. So they would say, look, what you actually get is a unique solution to this mathematical equation, which is the actual history of something. And it's there as a single mathematical entity in the mathematics, which is certainly true. Therefore, if you were an avid block defender, you would say, well, there you are. You see, it's already there in Newtonian physics. Now, personally, I don't think that's correct. I think it's totally neutral. That's particularly because there's a global time. I might say process theologians do worry actually a lot about the issues we're debating, but not, I think, in the context of Newtonian physics. It's relativity that causes them more problems. So the fact that there is a global time travel in Newtonian physics means if you want to say, but actually, on top of all of this, there is this notion of the now, which is a real thing, but not just an illusion. There's nothing in the mathematics that in any way violates you from doing that. I think the maths is totally neutral, personally. So, you know, you can. I think that this is one of these cases that you really can say it's just a question of which view you like. Now, when we come on to quantum Newtonian physics, you see for non-physicists in the audience, you're going to survey every time modern theoretical physics in half an hour. Quantum Newtonian physics, sorry, it's in my cover, is subtly different. The equations in quantum Newtonian physics, the dynamical equation is this. Now again, this is a differential equation which has a unique solution in terms of the state at some initial time. Now, on the face of it, you might think, this again is for Newtonian time, that looks as if the same thing is true, that it is neutral about how you interpret it. And certainly, mathematically speaking, you could interpret it in history terms, except that, unfortunately, as far as quantum mechanics is concerned, it's not, of course, how in fact we understand the theory. The whole question about the problem of measurement, which suddenly causes the state vector to change and so on. At least that's what people say. Right? I have lots of views on that, but that's what people say. And state vector reduction comes in. Now, under those circumstances, I find it personally very hard to know what to say, because in the conventional interpretation of quantum mechanics, anyway, as we heard last night, the view is someone makes a measurement and something happens which is purely undetermined. And then you start off with that new state of affairs and you evolve from there. Now, because you do not know in advance what's going to happen, you don't really have a history in the ordinary sense of the word. I mean, you might have a stochastic history, but it's not deterministic history anyway. Now, there's a related problem which comes from the uncertainty principle, which anyway says you can't specify history as a both position and momentum. But you could say lean towards a process view. I mean, that I think tend to suggest. And it was true for a very long time, actually. The curious thing about quantum mechanics is you could not discuss it in terms of history. Classical mechanics, you could do it either way around. Quantum mechanics, you couldn't, actually. It's only fairly recently, in the last 15 years or so, there has been a new approach to quantum theory. It's been evolved, which is partly responding to the needs of quantum cosmology, which is called the consistent history theory, which I've been involved in myself, and Don has a sort of alternative view of history theory too, competing paradigm, if you like. And this actually does assign probabilities to the whole histories of the system. Now, I'm not saying this has become the definitively received interpretation of quantum mechanics, because it hasn't, unfortunately. But nonetheless, insofar as it's a mathematical framework that makes sense, I think you can say, again, that this actually does lean back towards the block view. But that's about all I can say, I think, which is nothing, so far, I think, particularly problematic. The problems begin with special relativity. And this is something that the process theologians really do worry about. I've had lots of discussions with some of them over the years, and they really do bother about this. And it's this. Now, as those of you who've done relativity theory will know, the way the mathematics works, for a moment, is you're presented with something called Minkowski space-time. Now, it is Minkowski space-time. It's not Minkowski space with some notion of temporal evolution. It is space-time. Who first invented the word space-time, whether it was Einstein or Minkowski, or Poincare, I really don't know. Do you know?
I don't know. I don't know.
Poincare, I don't know. Anyway.
Could well be.
Yeah. In any event, if you're lecturing on this subject, say, to undergraduates, you'll start off, well, actually, you may not start off quite saying this embryo, but slightly more advanced undergraduates say, well, MB is a certain space-time manifold and so on. So that's how you talk about it, you see. Now, okay, so you ask, well, when, if you talk about space-time, where does time come in? And famously, time comes like this. You have this picture, this famous picture of roughly speaking, time going in that direction, sort of space in that direction. And nothing goes faster than the speed of light. And the speed of light are these cones I've drawn. These are possible paths of photons, if you like, or beams of light. And they're kind of fundamental. That's what separates. Everything in here is sort of time-like, if you like, and everything outside is space-like. Now, so then what about time itself? Well, the answer is each observer, which is the standard interpretation, has his or her own reference frame according to their speed. So if you have two observers moving relative to each other, then one observer will have a different concept of time for another. And how as we look in this diagram is simply that one observer will slice things like this. So this is one moment of time. There's another moment of time. You see, in the Newtonian picture, you have an absolute time. So you have space and time. You simply have slice, 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 slice. That's why it's pretty, I think, neutral about interpretation. This is not, because you have slice, 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 and slice, 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 slice. And they're simply not the same. Now then, if you're a block universe person, and this is normally the thing that you wave around with great pride, and say, there you are, and I'd actually know someone we know, get incredibly angry about this. I heard him once discussing this with John, and publicly, in a session like this, and really lost his temper, which is unusual for an academic, and I couldn't see why. It seemed to be the most bizarre thing to lose your temper about, but anyway, I'm not going to do it. Not even privately, so. But nonetheless, it is actually a question which has disturbed many philosophers and theologians, because the question is, well, if you really think, if you want to adopt a process view, shall we say, so you think there is really such thing as temporal evolution as a real thing, not just an illusion. With respect to which reference frame does the world evolve? And in particular, does God have a reference frame? Now, this is what John and I had in our first debate. It was kind of sort of like a biannual right thing, actually. We had this debate, but the first time we did it, it was actually about God's reference frame. And I invented a somewhat slightly facetious example of somebody praying for something to happen at a great distance, see. And the question is, one reference frame was happening at the same time as you, and another one was in the future. And so, anyway, it sounded very, very bizarre. Now, process theorists really worry about this. And there's no question that from a mathematical point of view, a physical point of view, which does tend to suggest a block view. Now, I know what John will say to this. I've heard him say this before. He'll say so much the worse for the mathematics if it does that, because it simply shows it's not doing the job properly, which could very well be true. But as far as the theory is concerned, anyway, this definitely, I would say, leans towards, shall we say, a block view of things. And there's something to be answered there, which, I say, still causes some angst around theological problems. Now, what about general relativity? It gets worse then. In general relativity, you have a curved space. I'm showing you these. I normally in my lecture, I try to do things in colour, because it helps people. I've discovered a long time ago with students that they concentrate longer if you've got things in colour. It extends the attention time about 10 minutes, not because you've got a crucial 10 minutes, you see. But unfortunately, my colour printer's broken down at college. And what I have is a laser printer, which is black and white, so that's why they're this interesting colour. So you have this sort of shape. This thing now is meant as a curved space-time. And the same general principle holds. You still have time going up that way like space that way. But now, in general relativity, rather than having just these really sort of planes, which are sort of rigidly, geometrically sort of planes, any sort of surface would do it, any sort of shape you can imagine. So here I've drawn it as if it was like Newtonian time. You could have sort of slices like this and so on. Each one is a different choice of time. Now, as far as the theory is concerned, they're all on the same footing. And so, though you can interpret general relativity as being a history of space, it's even worse than special relativity when it comes to this process perspective. Now, one of the problems, I won't go into this causal stuff, but it's the fact is the choice of time depends on the matter, on the geometry, which depends on the matter around you. So it's a curious thing, there's no absoluteness about it. So what is true is it certainly emphasises space-time as a single unit. And although it's true in this sort of picture, you can sort of adopt a process view by slicing, even though it's highly arbitrary. There are actually space-times where you can't do that at all. I mean, there are solutions to the equations of general relativity. We actually can't do this slicing. It's simply not possible. Now, John will say, well, there you are. Those solutions obviously don't exist in nature. That may be true. You see, I should explain, in case you haven't guessed already, I'm a thoroughgoing Platonist through and through and through. John is a Platonist as far as mathematics is concerned, but I think he leans towards the Aristotelian view. I'm very keen on Jung. I think these are two great sort of archetypal splits in the human race, actually, the human psyche. The Platonists on one side and the Aristotelians on another. So the Platonists love this sort of block view, because everything is there. In particular, Platonists like me like to consider all possible solutions of things. Actually, I've never been interested in the actual universe. It may seem a strange thing for scientists to say, but in a sense it's true. I'm always intrigued by what possibilities, what could there be, you see. So the actual universe, of course, is interesting, but it's not what I want to study myself. So for me, the fact that there is a solution, which could be physically available, probably isn't, but it could be in principle, I suppose, is important. But like I've said, John's response would be a robust saying, well, just goes to show you the theory is wrong. I think that's right. Now, the only other thing I'm going to talk about, because I want to leave John plenty of time to respond, and we'll have a bit of an argument if you want to, is the problem of quantum cosmology, which Don's going to talk about later today, on page. I think,
Yeah, tomorrow, although maybe not so much detail, so maybe you should cover
no, I'm sure not the details. We're just trying to transparency. Yeah, I once was a lecturer at Imperial College where the seminar speaker turned up, he took his transparencies out of his briefcase and discovered he brought the wrong lecture. And Gary Gibbons, who works here, some of you will know, famously was once at a conference in Jerusalem, and he was walking across the plenary lecture actually, and he, like many theoretical physicists do, he'd written his note just on the slides with transparencies. And it started to rain, he bucketed down with rain. Unfortunately, he hadn't used water resistant. I wasn't there, but people swear this was true. So he arrived to give his lecture, a bit suddenly massive. So just temporarily losing one overhead is a minor glitch. Imagine though what it's like to stand in front of an audience of 600 people expecting a major review talk and you've had all your transparencies washed out. That really tests your ability to give a lecture, I think.
Sounds like a typical
Now,
experience.
I don't know myself whether John would regard quantum cosmology as relevant to this. In the past, when we discussed these things, we kind of agreed that it probably isn't, or at least we won't talk about it very much. What is true is that when you start talking about quantum cosmology, i.e. quantum geometry, then that picture I drew of the sort of space-time is itself, if you like, subject to quantum fluctuations. I mean, it's not totally true, but it's good enough statement for this particular purpose. Now, as a result of that, it means that because it suffers quantum fluctuations, even what you're allowed to call time, in a sense, is suffering quantum fluctuations. So it's got worse and worse and worse now. I mean, there isn't even any there's no actual, in that sense, really fundamental choice of time out there in the world at these scales, because it's also part and parcel of the quantum mess. Now, at this level, I mean, the common view most people have is that, in fact, space and time are emergent properties, and so is the notion of causality. Now, another virtue of this picture is it does allow you to talk about the beginning of time, which I think Don will talk about tomorrow, at least a little bit. What can you say here? I mean, if you work in this field, one is certainly, you tend to be led by the mathematics, let's put it like that. And the mathematics tends to dictate to you the philosophical view that you adopt. And in fact, there simply isn't any space and time. I think that's the truth of the matter here. So the debate about process or block becomes just meaningless. Now, as I've never actually asked John this flat out, whether he thinks quantum cosmology is relevant or not, I don't know. You could argue it's not, I suppose. It's certainly relevant at the beginning of the universe, presumably. But whether it's relevant at ordinary scales, I don't know. So these are the fundamental issues then. Now, so I've only sketched this very slightly, but the basic, let me just recap, is for Newtonian physics, because of the nature of the way we think about time, Newtonian, what Newton thought about as an absolute time, the mathematics is neutral, I think anyway, with respect to a process view or a block view. When you come to special relativity, as quantum mechanics swings, because of the nature of quantum theory, slightly towards the process view. At least ordinary quantum theory does. When you come to special relativity, it swings back towards the block view, and with general relativity, it becomes even more block-like. But when you come to quantum gravity, it gets more complicated. In fact, while the early part of my career, I spent working on an approach to quantum gravity which is purely three-dimensional. So it doesn't talk about space-time at all, it just talks about space. So obviously there you can say, well, that swings back towards the process view. So you see, really, as far as modern physics is concerned, if one's honest, you just have this oscillation between two different points of view. As I say, I myself have never been completely convinced there's an actual fact of the matter about this. One of us is right, one of us is wrong. I'm inclined to think still it's kind of more different psychological perceptions of the same thing. But John and I think slightly differently from this. At this stage, I'll pass it over to him, and he'll give his sort of his view, and then we can have a public discussion, I think. Okay, John.
Well, thank you, Chris.
Yeah, that's a watch. Yes, thank you.
Right. Let me start. Excuse me. Let me start off with a terminological point. Among theologians, process theology means the theology that derives from the philosophical ideas of Alfred North Whitehead, particularly as contained in his famous and extremely difficult book, Process and Reality. And I won't go into the details of that. It's the only really ambitious new metaphysical scheme produced in the 20th century. But I don't buy it, and I'm not a process theologian in that technical sense. I'm a theologian who believes in process, but not in that sense. And that, my point of view, today is very often called open theology, because it believes that the future is open to us. So just to get the terminology straight, if you read some of the theological literature. Now, what about the block universe? First of all, let's start with the science end. And let's think about special relativity. General relativity, of course, is more complicated. I don't think it probably, with one exception I'll mention in a minute, raises entirely new problems. The two arguments that are often adduced from special relativity in favour of the block universe point of view is, first of all, this observer dependence of the view of the world, that different observers will judge different distant events to be simultaneous or not simultaneous in different ways according to their state of motion. And if that's the case, if observer A thinks that these two events occurred at the same time, and observer B thinks that one of them occurred before the other, doesn't that show that time differences are fundamentally illusory, and therefore it is the whole space-time continuum we should consider? I think that's the argument which is often presented. And our anonymous mutual friend, I think, particularly takes that point of view. I think that's a mistaken argument, because when observers talk about the simultaneity or otherwise of distant events, they are only aware of those events and are therefore only able to speak about them when they are already within that observer's past light cone. They have to receive a message from them. So their different judgments of simultaneity are essentially different ways in which they organize their description of what is unambiguously past. And that, ambiguity cannot of itself establish the already existing character of the future. So I think the argument from special relativity in that sense is a mistaken argument. The other argument, of course, is that physics assigns no particular value to t equals significance to t equals 0, so to speak. There is no present moment present in the equations of physics. Correctly predicted, I should say, so much the worse for physics in that respect. But of course, in relation, now we come on to a point which somehow draws general relativity into the matter. General relativity is a peculiar subject, not only because of its counterintuitive character, but what is the status of the solutions to Einstein's field equations? Potentially, each of them describes a world, but of course there is only one universe that they actually describe. So general relativity has lots of solutions which are extremely interesting in their way, but which are not things that we need to take seriously in relation to the world in which we live. In fact, Kurt Gödel, that amazingly clever man, showed that there are closed time-like curves in certain kinds of solution to general relativity, which poses all sorts of problems, obviously, for causality and so on. But those are interesting solutions, but they're not the solutions that apply to our universe. And in fact, our universe has a very particular character to it. It's almost, on its larger scale, it's almost homogeneous. And there is a natural definition of cosmic time, the definition that the cosmologists use, where they tell us that the universe is 13.7 billion years old. There is a preferred frame of reference in relation to the overall structure of our universe, and namely that which is at rest with respect to the cosmic background radiation. And if that's the case, that would, I think, be, if God is involved with time, that would be God's natural time of the frame of reference in relation to creation. And it might also be the source of the moving present moment that seems to me to be so basic a part of human experience. You might say it's a bit far-fetched, isn't it, to think that our local experience of time here is somehow related to the overall cosmic structure of the world. But we've encountered another example of that. You will remember that the German philosopher, physicist Ernst Mach pointed out that inertial frames of reference here on Earth are at rest or in uniform motion with respect to the fixed stars. In other words, local mechanical properties are somehow related to the global distribution of matter in the universe. It's one of these things that discussion of which ups and downs and twos and fro's over the century. So that there is at least a suggestion of local properties being influenced by cosmic properties, and that might also, it seems to me, be true of our experience of the present moment. So what I'm trying to argue now is that we can take science absolutely seriously, but it does not drive us to, and Chris I think would agree with this, doesn't drive us to have to accept the picture of the block universe. Einstein, of course, believed that it did. He notoriously wrote to the widow of his great friend Michele Besso, reminding her that though her husband was no longer with her, he was there back in the past, so to speak. He hadn't got lost, even if he wasn't any more accessible. I think that's a pretty weak form of consolation, actually, but there it is. And actually, I think the question of the nature of time, whether it is a flowing time or whether it is a block time, in the sense we've been thinking, is fundamentally a metaphysical question. I said last night, talking about different interpretations of quantum theory, that causality is constrained by physics but not determined by physics. So you can either have a deterministic or an indeterministic view of the world. I think the same is true of temporality. I think you can take a block universe view, or you can take a unfolding view, an open view, a world of becoming rather than a world of static being, so to speak. And whichever view you take, you will defend not simply by appeal to physics, but you'll have to defend it by appeal to certain other metaphysical arguments that come in. And now we might turn our attention to theology and say, what will theology have to say about this issue? There are basically two different schools of theological thought about God's relationship to time. One is the school of classical theology. It found its first clear expression in the writings of Boethius, then was taken up by Augustine and Aquinas, very much by many of the theologians of the Reformation and so on. Classical theology pictures God as being totally outside of time, looking down upon the whole of cosmic history laid out before the divine gaze. It's argued, and I think argued correctly, that that view of God's knowledge of creation does not subvert the freedom of creatures. God's foreknowledge of what a free agent was going to do would surely threaten the freedom of that agent's action, although there have been theologians, Molina, for example, who argued against that. But the classical theology view is God sees the whole of history laid out before the atemporal divine gaze. Every event of history is simultaneous to God. God has no foreknowledge. God simply has knowledge. God knows what I did yesterday, knows what I am doing now, knows what I am going to do tomorrow, because they are in that atemporal way present to God. That's the picture of classical theology. It's a profound and subtly worked out understanding. And as I say, I've just been arguing, it's the question of the nature of temporality is not the same as the question of the nature of causality. You hold different views in relation to those things. Now, if classical theism is the right way of thinking about it, it means that the way that God knows creation is as a block creation. The whole of history, space-time, laid out before the divine gaze. And theologically, we surely know that God knows things according to their true nature. Chris posed the question at the beginning of his talk, what is God's scale? Well, God has no scale in that respect. God knows things as they actually are. He knows 10 to the minus 35 meters, the same way he knows whatever it is. So if God knows the universe in that classical theological way, and God's knowledge is true knowledge, it seems to me that it would be an implication that which is very, very seldom drawn by classical theologians, that the block universe is the true reality. God knows things as they really are. If God knows the universe in a block way, then that's the right way of thinking about it. So I think block universe people are going to have some quite powerful theological disposition on this side. I'm not a classical theologian. I'm an open theologian in the sense I described at the beginning. If we believe that we live in a world of unfolding becoming, a world in which events are successive, a world in which the future is not yet formed, but there are a whole range of causal principles that act to bring about the future, the laws of nature, the action of free agents, God's providential interaction with the unfolding history of the world, all these things, all these causal principles collaborate to produce the future. If that's the world in which we live, which I believe to be the world in which we live, then it also seems to follow that God will know that creation in accordance with its nature. And that means, I think, that God will not only know that events are successive, but God will know them truly according to their nature. That is to say, God will know them in their succession. And if if that argument is correct, then God has, in bringing it into being a temporal world, God has freely condescended to engage with temporality. Of course, there is an eternal aspect of God, an eternal pole in the divine nature. God's steadfast love and so on is unchanging, and if there was a time when time was not, then God was still there, so to speak. It's impossible to phrase these sentences in a wholly meaningful way, but you know what I mean. So God is not enthralled to time in the way that we creatures are. But God, I believe, in bringing into being a temporal creation, as an act, just as God brought into being a world in which creatures are free to be themselves and to make themselves. And that was a kenosis, as the theologians say, a self-limitation of God's power. Not everything is brought about by God's direct exercise of power. Creatures have a modest degree of power to play their parts in bringing about the future. So I believe in bringing into being a temporal world, there was a kenosis of divine omniscience. God knows events in their succession. And that means, I think, that God does not yet know the future. And there is no imperfection in God, because the future is not yet there to be known. That's the view. Of course, it's contentious, and I be very surprised if you're all going to shout Amen at the end of my contribution. But that's how I make sense of things. The difference I might point out between what I'm saying and what a process theologian would say. A process theologian would say that God has no choice, that God is inevitably, process encompasses everything, including the divine nature. God is inescapably caught up in an unfolding process. There is it is a metaphysical necessity upon God, from the process point of view, that God does not know the future, that God has a temporal pole. I don't think that's right. I think that it is an act of divine kenosis, of self-limitation, of divine gracious condescension, that God engages with time in that sort of way. And of course, that picture of God's relationship to history is one that is certainly consonant with the way that God is frequently portrayed in the Bible. Of course, we know that the writers of the Bible are human writers. Particularly, we know that the Hebrew scriptures are very anthropomorphic in their descriptions of God. But they do present a God who is indeed engaged with time. I mean, the Hebrew scriptures are bold enough to speak of God changing God's mind. Hezekiah says to God says to Hezekiah, rather, you're going to die. And Hezekiah said, no, I don't want to die yet, Lord. God said, okay, 15 more years of life for you. I mean, that's obviously an anthropomorphic way of describing something. But the God of the scriptures is a God who is deeply involved in history, in the unfolding history and the ups and downs of the history of Israel, and of course in the temporal episode of the incarnation, the birth under Augustus and the death under Tiberius. So I think there is a good deal of consonance between scripture and an open view of what's going on in the world. So that's, I think, really what I want to say is, you see, it's very interesting that there are these connections. Because the nature of temporality is a matter of metaphysical decision, it is one that is properly influenced by theological considerations as well as other, say, philosophical considerations. And I think that it is an open matter, which theological position you take, just as it's an open matter, I think, metaphysically about how you interpret a physical process. So that's what I think about it.
Can I respond? Yes, please
Yeah,
do.
well, please do.
I mean, one of the problems I always have in debating with John is I'm extremely sympathetic to his theological views. However, we can't let him get away with everything. So let me take the sentence, God does not know the future. Okay. Now, that sentence clearly is implied, I think John was implied, that there is, in fact, we would say as scientists, some preferred reference frame, if you wish, and this is the frame which God is using, at least in God's relation to the world. Now, John then went on to say, well, this is obviously the cosmic time.
Yeah.
But of course, the trouble with that is there isn't a cosmic time, not really. That's only an approximation. I mean, if there really were that sort of cosmic time, everything would be homogeneous. We wouldn't be here. I mean, in fact, it's not like that. I mean, it's roughly true, but it's not absolutely true by any means whatsoever. For example, if I take one step to the side here, I've changed what's possible time we can have according to general relativity. I come back again, I've shifted it back. Now, the question is, how do one accommodate that? Now, you might want to say, this is just a physicist nitpicking, and that God works on the average, but I don't actually quite see why that makes sense, because God himself said that God doesn't, sorry, John said that God doesn't have a scale, in which case God is present. I take it by that he means that all what we physicists call scales of events, in which case I think I can legitimately say, okay then, but in actual fact is not the case as a cosmic time. It is of course true as an approximate one, but not in an absolute sense. And once you've said that, and once you've lost any notion of an absolute time, then the notion of the future becomes highly problematic. Now, you can always say, well, there's some way of choosing the future, but whatever that is, it certainly doesn't come out of physics. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The other is something quite different, which I didn't mention, perhaps should have done, is the notion of proper time. Because you see, actually, what do you experience? What do I experience? What we experience is our heartbeats going and our lives just evolving. That's what we actually experience. Now, it's a curious thing, because I think I'm always amazed at this, it's a curious thing, that somehow the world is contrived in such a way we can fit all these different proper times together. our own individual experience. It's some notion of some time out there which we're all marching in accordance with. I mean, that's kind of what we feel. And that's what, in a sense, Newtonian physics is all about. Now, when you come to general relativity, it gets a lot more interesting because you still have all these notions of proper time. And that is well defined. I mean, let's be clear about it. Here it doesn't matter how inhomogeneous things are. It doesn't matter. There really is, for each individual entity, there really is a thing called proper time. That's the proper type of that quantity. But they do not fit together in a way which gives any concept of an overall present or now. So each entity, if you like, does have a genuine sense of the evolution of time. So I guess John would say, in so far as the entity relates to God, God experiences that entity's experience of the passage of time. There is not a single time with respect to which this is happening. It's simply not possible. Whether that's significant or not, I don't know. I mean, it's the sort of thing that genuine process stations do worry about. But these would be my concerns. And also, of course, the other thing is with the word "the" in the future. I mean, there's two. I mean, to my mind, there's two problems with the word "the." One is what I've just said, but the really important problem is the quantum use of the word "the," because when John talks, he talks as if there was an actual fact of the matter. Because it's not, again, not really quite true, because we don't know what role quantum theory plays in all these things. Maybe it's not relevant. Maybe we simply shouldn't worry about the scale of quantum theory. But if there are such things as quantum fluctuations in space and time, and if they are relevant, the problem gets even worse. But I think the worst problem is one I've already mentioned, is that there simply isn't, in fact, a cosmic time scale. And I'd like to ask John what his reaction to that is. This is maybe a dialogue.
Okay, shall I come?
Well, I can't. Yeah, if we can.
I think just for the sake of the camera,
I think it's way better, yes.
The podium. Well, I agree, of course, that there was a certain amount of hand-waving what I said. There isn't an exact cosmic time in that sense. But I think all that's necessary is that there should, if there is a specific frame of reference that defines God's relationship to time, and therefore defines, if you like, the nature of the future, that, of course, has to be hidden in relation to the relativistic laws of physics. And that explains why, for example, in special relativity, we can reconcile our proper time experiences. Going the two twin in the twins experiment, the two twins seem to be going to the future in different rates, but of course they're in terms of this hidden moving frame of reference, they're moving forward at the same time. There are lots of puzzles of that sort, but I don't think myself that they subvert completely the position that I'm seeking to defend. And of course, it's further perplexified by quantum cloudiness. I didn't respond to your challenge about quantum cosmology. I think my answer to that would be when there is a quantum cosmology, I'll try and respond to that. So yes, there are difficulties. The difficulties in the two points of view are located at different levels. I mean, I think the block universe difficulty is located at, if you like, at the level of direct, I would wish to argue, basic human experience. And the difficulties of the open view, which you've referred to in your response to me, are located at these different hidden and least understood levels. I think nobody's going to be free from problems, but I believe either side is, in the end of the day, at liberty to make a metaphysical decision about what interpretation to do.
But then would you agree with it? It's just a question of making a choice. Because in the past when we discussed this, I thought you felt there was an actual fact of the matter, that it wasn't just a question of you know.
I think there's an actual fact of the matter, but I think I don't think we have an unambiguous, unchallengeable way of determining what is the fact of the matter. And the fact of the matter is God's eye view of what's going on. So I think there is a fact of the matter, but the judgment we make about what that fact is, it's just like I mean, I think it is useful to keep in mind the ambiguity of the nature of causality in thinking about this. Not because the two problems are not unrelated to each other, but it's just to exemplify that there are decisions that have to be made about metaphysical matters. And maybe we used to say, as we let these people have a go at us.
Yeah, I think we've covered them all.
Well, let's give our two speakers a round of applause. a start to the day and very, very lively debate between the two. Don has a question.
I just had a minor thing. Of course, I mean, if you wanted to get out a fairly natural thing from the physics, if you had pure classical GR with a Big Bang, you could just always take the proper time of the longest causal curve back to the Big Bang as giving you cosmic time, even if it is inhomogeneous. Of course, that will give hypersurfaces that may have kinks in them when you will have crosssticks, but you could, now whether God chose that or not, but
why would you do that, Doc? I mean, you know as well as I do. In fact, there's zillions and zillions of such choices you could make. I mean,
yeah, but I'm just saying that we can't, that you can make a gauge invariant choice. It's arbitrary, and you might say why. I mean, to my view, it's ugly. I mean, I think the block view universe is much simpler. That's why I prefer it. But still, I'm just saying, if you didn't have the quantum thing. But if you have the quantum thing, of course, then there's presumably, in the path integral, there's presumably vast numbers of different proper times you could get. So there'd be quantum uncertainty in the time. And so I think the quantum thing is what really makes it difficult from physics to define it. Although I think, as John said, maybe you could do it theologically.
Actually, could I pick this up and ask John something? Because I've asked him this every time we've debated it. I'm not sure the answer's changed from time. You do believe that just inside quantum physics, as far as classical GR is concerned, there is actually some way God does choose a slicing.
I believe, as far as I understand these matters, that there is a consistent possibility of divine choice.
Okay.
The quantum theory does complicate it, but it complicates all our thought in this sort of area. So I don't want to just take the easy way out of saying who knows, although I would want to say God knows.
Okay, yes.
I'd like to ask us, you said that God does not know the future, and you also gave reference to biblical episodes to corroborate that. So how would you explain Jesus' knowledge about Judas's betrayal? I mean, from a theological point of view, how do you explain that?
That's a very good question. Can I respond from here? Yes. Well, the way I think about it is this. God, of course, what I'm saying is I believe that God does not know in exquisite detail the future, because the future is not yet there to be known. But of course, God sees how history is moving, how events are moving, in a way that you and I are incapable of doing. Let me first come on to Jesus in a minute. Let me start with Jeremiah. God sends a message to the king of Judah through Jeremiah that Pharaoh is not going to come up from Egypt and rescue them, and he better make the best terms he can with Nebuchadnezzar. I think that is a true message that God sent through Jeremiah, and I think that God saw how the history of the Middle East was moving at that time. I do not think it is necessary to believe, and I do not myself believe, that God knew already which particular Chaldean soldier would be the first to put the torch to burn down the temple in Jerusalem. You see, there's a difference between seeing the shape of history. Similarly, I think with Jesus, Jesus sees what's going on, of course. He sees what's in people. He sees the whatever is going on in Judas's mind. He knows, of course, when he goes to Jerusalem that he's going to have a confrontation with the authorities. He expects that he will be put to death, and he trusts in God to vindicate him. I myself take seriously the passion predictions in the synoptic gospels. But I don't think for a minute that Jesus saw the events of Holy Week in detail laid out before him. That would make Gethsemane, which is one of the deepest and most profound episodes in the gospel, that would make it a charade, which it very clearly isn't. So there again, it seems to me there is a degree of knowledge. But
he knows that Judas is going to dip the bread.
Sorry?
He knows that Judas is going to dip the bread in his plate. So he knows the details.
No, actually, he dips the bread and then gives it to Judas. In the actual story, he knows. I'm sure Jesus knows that he is going to be betrayed, and he knows the one who is going to betray him. That seems to me perfectly consistent with deep insight. I mean, John's Gospel says Jesus knew what was in humankind, and I think that's true. But I don't think that means that he, in his mind's eye, so to speak, saw exactly the moment Judas was going to leave, the exact words he was going to speak to the high priest. That's what I think.
That's very interesting, John. I mean, does that relate back to the physics in a way, and the sort of quantum fuzziness, and God knows broadly what's sort of going to happen, but not
Yes.
in intricate detail.
But yes, that's how. I mean, I think God. I mean, we are continually caught out by the future. Things happen that we didn't expect, and we don't know what to make of them. I mean, I don't think God is caught out in that sort of way. And I don't think that God has already a detailed knowledge of future events.
Don wants to come
Just-
back. But,
Is there another? Yeah,
Well-
we'll just comment on that.
okay, just
Yeah,
I mean, one might, of course, imagine that Jesus in his kenosis did not know. In fact, there is the part where he talks about people asking, well, when would God return? And Jesus said, that hour no one knows, not even the Son,
Right.
but the Father. So it could be that he only knew, while he was here on earth in his limited form, what God revealed to him. So I'm just saying you maybe can't necessarily conclude that God the Father doesn't know just because Jesus in his limited incarnated form didn't know.
No, I agree about that. Absolutely, that's right. I mean, it's very important, I think, to take absolutely seriously the incarnation. Jesus became a first-century Palestinian. I don't think for a minute that Jesus knew about quantum theory, though of course the Word obviously knows more about quantum theory than you or I know. No. So I mean, it's very important that we're not dissecting that Jesus' appearance is a sort of just an act. And that's why I started with Jeremiah rather than going straight to Jesus, where we are talking about God's relationship to time and God's relationship to the future.
thank you. Yes.
Actually, my question is very similar, but going to the examples which you gave us about this 15 years, if God doesn't know the future, it means that he should take care that he will continue this 15 years. Otherwise, who knows, maybe after one day somebody will kill him or...
Yes,
It's
yes.
just very
That's
different information, 15 years. So.
That's a good point. Yes. Well, that depends on whether you think that the 15 years is an exact measure to the day Hezekiah is going to keel over. I think we have to have a little flexibility. We also have to recognise that Scripture is written in a style which I myself don't think lends itself to absolutely fantastically detailed literal interpretation. It is. I mean, people in the ancient world didn't think that sort of way. On Thursday, I had to preach about the Ascension, and two of our readings were the end of Luke and the beginning of Acts. The same author. At the end of the Gospel, Jesus apparently, the Ascension takes place on Easter Day, and in Acts it takes place 40 days later after a series of appearances. So what's going on? Well, what's going on is that both, in my view, in both pieces of writing, Luke is telling the same story, but he's not worried about the numerical detail in a way that modern scientific historians would worried about. We have to take into account the genre of scripture, of scriptural writing, that it's not written in a modern scientific style, in my view.
More questions? Hilary.
This is another theological question. I was just thinking about, you're talking about God's self-limiting his knowledge. Do you think if that's true, that he knows all the potentialities of choices of events unfolding?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Yes. There was I briefly referred to him, there was a Spanish Jesuit theologian called Molina, who believed that God had a form of what he called middle knowledge. That is, that God knew what a free agent would do in given circumstances. I think that's an incoherent belief, but there are people who adopt it.
Yes, Gerard?
Can I ask a question on the, if you say that the future is not determined in the sense that also even God does not know it, that also is also a position on the question of determinism. In classical physics, in fact, the state of everything that happens in the future is already contained in the present state. Now in quantum theory that is more subtle than that, but it's not completely abandoned. So what is your, do you also take a state do you also take a stand on determinism by saying
Yes,
that?
yes, I do. Yes, I do. I think it's essential to do so. I referred very briefly last night to the discovery of intrinsic unpredictabilities present in science's account of the world. Again, how you interpret those is a metaphysical issue. I interpret them as being ontological signs of openness rather than epistemic deficits of knowledge. And by saying openness, I don't mean that the future is some sort of random lottery, but that there is scope for the operation of causal principles other than those described by science in its canonical story of the exchange of energy between constituents. And that seems to me a plausible belief to hold, because I think we have pretty direct experience of being actual agents. When I raise my arm, of course there is bits and pieces of kind of what's going on, currents flow in the nose, muscles contract, but I raise my arm. It's an action of me. It's my action as an agent. Somehow or other, if science doesn't describe a world that accommodates that, then science has so much the worse for science. And I think that the discovery of intrinsic unpredictabilities was a gain for science, actually, rather than a loss. It began to be able to see that it was describing a world in which we could properly conceive ourselves as being inhabitants.
Does that also mean that you actually could have predicted in the times of Newtonian physics that Newtonian physics must be wrong, or just that physics is incomplete?
Yeah, I mean, and of course Newton himself didn't take a mechanical, as you know, he didn't take a mechanical view of the world. It was his successors, particularly the great French people like Laplace and so on, who followed Newton, who developed the sort of clockwork picture of a mechanical universe. Newton himself believed in the action of spirits and so on, angelic corrections to the solar system, because of instabilities and things of that nature. Now, chap here's been trying to say something. Yeah.
Okay, I have two questions, and the first question is on the classical theism view. Doesn't that focus very much on God's transcendence, on his overall view? He sits on the mountaintop and sees everything at once.
Yeah.
But in the classical theism, isn't also God's immanence very important? So then, wouldn't he also know all frames of reference if he was immanent in all things, even those moving? And the second question was to you, sir. If God limits himself in some kind of kenosis, doesn't that lead to that God in some sense becomes surprised when things happen?
Please? No, please, yeah. Let me take the first one first. I mean, I think it is one of the defects of classical theism. Though formally it spoke of divine transcendence and divine immanence, it very much emphasized divine transcendence, excuse me, in the way that it was formulated. Aquinas said that God acts upon creatures, but creatures do not act upon God. It was the distant God of classical theism was, I think, an unsatisfactory view. And that's why a lot of people who think theologically in the science and theology area adopt the view of panentheism, that the world is part of God, but God exceeds the world. Arthur Peacock takes that point of view, Ian Barber takes that point of view. I strongly do not. I think it's very important to keep a separation between creator and creation, but God is more present to creation than I think classical theology was able to acknowledge. I've really tried to say, I think God sees the shape of history, sees how it's developing. But yes, I mean, the things could happen that I think it's an implication of that. That God might be surprised.
I think one of the problems that sometimes raised for the classical view is that God actually, on that view, can't know what I'm doing now, because in a sense there is no now. Which is very wise.
Well,
It's the whole thing.
God says God is strictly atemporal. That view. God has no temporal knowledge in that sense. And that's back to this argument about. That's exactly a way of phrasing the argument. What is the true nature of reality? If the true nature of reality is atemporal, which is what the Locke universe says, then God surely must know it atemporally. If his tower is temporal, then of course God must in some way have accepted an engagement with temporality.
Yes, Chiranjeev.
This is a question to both of you, taking on the classical theology of God is out of time. you see, Jesus existed, like Father, Son, and Holy Spirit have existed since eternity. But Jesus enters the world at a particular time, like Jesus' humanity enters, both his divinity and humanity being present. And then he dies and is resurrected again. And that his humanity is still there, but it's a different form of humanity, a new humanity. Now, if you take him outside of time, his humanity did not exist. But then his new humanity will exist into eternity. So actually, he is no longer outside of time. He has entered time. So how do you, is there a paradox somewhere?
Well, there are lots of paradoxes about the incarnation. I think that of course, theology sees the Word as eternally existent, but the assumption of humanity by the Word as being an event that took place in time, as I say, under Augustus. And what I was trying to hint at last night, and something I said last night, was that when Jesus is raised from the dead, Jesus is raised as a human being, as well as being the second person of the Trinity. He's raised as a human being, but into the embodied life, if you like, whatever that means, of the new creation. So I think, because it's very, I'm puzzled and confused and incoherent about thinking about this, but it's always been part of mainstream Christian thinking that in Jesus' resurrection and ascension, humanity was taken, in some sense, into the divine nature as a prefiguration of our sharing in the divine life, in the life of the world to come. So I think that if Jesus has if Jesus' humanity has a continuing temporal experience, which I think it must have, it will be in the time of the new creation, not in the present time, in that sense.
Just a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Genesis says that human beings were created in God's image.
Yeah.
Now, so when you mentioned that humanity was taken into the divine nature, it's the other way, like human into God's nature.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I'm very much influenced by the thought that is powerful in the Eastern Church, in the Orthodox community, that ultimate human destiny is theosis, is a deification. It doesn't mean we're all going to become little gods. That's an absurd thought. But that we are going to share in the divine life in a way that we don't in this world. So as far as it's possible for finite beings to enter into the infinite riches of the divine nature, that will be granted to us. I mean, a way of expressing that would be to say, this is a world in which there are sacraments, in which there are covenanted occasions, on which the veil between divine reality and human nature is thin, but not removed. In the world to come, the whole world to come will be wholly sacramental. It will be suffused with the life and energies of God. That's how I think about it. You?
I have a question about this. This question about when God creates the world. I have read your book. You have a view that God empties himself in creating the world.
Yes.
So there's somewhere where God is not present in the sense that He is present in Himself.
No. I mean, the divine kenosis is a divine emptying, but it's not a complete emptying. It's not an annihilation of the divine nature. It's a self-limitation of the divine nature. So the divine power is not thrown away, but it is. God willingly restricts the exercise of divine power to allow creatures to have the power to be themselves and make themselves. And I was suggesting earlier this morning that there is a similar restriction of divine knowledge in that respect. Every theist would surely believe that God is omniscient in the sense of knowing everything that is possible to know. But if you live in a world of true becoming, where the future is not yet there, then the future is not yet there to be known. So God, on that view, possesses what the philosophers call a current omniscience, knowing everything that is knowable now, but not an absolute omniscience, knowing everything that will ultimately be knowable. I think that's a coherent point of view to take.
Do you think God could have done it differently?
Sorry?
Could God have done it differently? Did He have to do it that way?
Oh yes. Well, that's the difference between me and the process theologians properly so called, they think he couldn't. I mean, God had no choice about that. That was the metaphysical necessity. I think that it's an act of gracious will of God.
There's a question at the back.
Yeah, just to put things a little crudely, perhaps. You say that God only has a knowledge of how things will kind of generally evolve rather than specific knowledge of the future. Does that mean that in a crude way he could be wrong?
Well, I don't mean by that God has just a hazy notion of things are going to get better or life's going to complexify, that sort of thing. God has a pretty, as I say, I think God saw, for example, that Pharaoh wasn't going to come up out of Egypt and rescue the besieged people in Jerusalem. So God has a pretty detailed notion of what's going on, but not an absolutely exhaustive knowledge of what is going to happen. God can see, I suppose, in Nebuchadnezzar. Let's take a slightly bizarre example. God sees that Nebuchadnezzar is thinking, what shall I do? Shall I cut my losses and go back to Babylon, or shall I press forward and dispose of this lot? God sees Nebuchadnezzar thinking about that, and God perceives all the forces of kingly pride and authority and so on, which are going to push Nebuchadnezzar in the direction of storming Jerusalem. But I don't think that God knows absolutely, unquestionably, that's what Nebuchadnezzar is going to do. Nebuchadnezzar has a free choice. God expects that he's going to do that, and of course that's what happened. That's why with some reluctance, I have to admit, I acknowledge that God could be surprised.
A flood of questions. And Andrew?
I was wondering if we could go back to the measurement problem in the quantum world that Chris touched on in what he said at the start, and ask how that influences any of our thinking about this, and whether even within the straight scientific picture, before we come to the relationship with theology, a measurement is a sort of disruption in a block view. I suppose that if you were thinking in terms of local hidden variables, that would not be a problem, because you could still have a complete mechanistic, deterministic system, but all the evidence seems to be against that kind of interpretation. Well, there's actually more evidence against the non-local hidden variables too. I think at least some models that depend on them. But well, the first one is the straight scientific question: is how disruptive would that be? And then the second one is, what sort of knowledge of the universe are we thinking of God's knowledge as being? In other words, would it be something like knowledge of the wave function, which could be completely deterministic, or is it more like an observation that we would make, and what would the implications of that be?
It's interesting how the subject of the foundations of quantum theory has changed over the years. I mean, when I was a student, which was a long time ago now, it was something you did when you became vaguely senile, broadly speaking. And when you stopped doing physics and you started doing so-called philosophy, and all that changed, of course, with John Bell's work. And it became, not only is it respectable, you can even get tenure for doing it now at Imperial College. So it's become quite a different sort of subject. And most of the people, I myself, these days, I work in the foundations of quantum theory. But myself, like Roger Penrose, many other people who think about these things a great deal, simply think quantum theory is not actually correct. And that what we have is an approximate to something, and this is simply our way of talking about it as we know it at the moment. And certainly if you work in quantum cosmology, you more or less have to take that point of view. And so over the last 20 years particularly, all sorts of attempts have been made to either change quantum theory or get beyond it altogether. Now, personally, I think that's correct, and therefore the measurement problem in a sense wouldn't be a problem. But of course, having said that, there are these theorems about whatever it is, you can't go back to classical physics. I think that's clear. So whatever this new theory is going to be, it won't just be back to the deterministic picture. But I would myself want to hold fire on that. I mean, you could talk for hours about the measurement problem, but I think it's maybe, a bit chasing after, whatever we call it. Yeah. So, but with my immediate reactions, one shouldn't get too worried about it. disagree, John? You don't.
Yeah, well, I mean, I read what I said last night. Our knowledge of the causal structure of the world is very patchy, and we don't really quite know properly how to think about it. And if we do think about it, we certainly have to make some metaphysical decisions about it. I mean, there are people, for example, I'm not one of them, and I often alleged to be one of them, who think that God acts through determining the outcome of quantum events. People who think that way usually don't realise how problematic the notion of a quantum event is actually. I don't think that God does it all by scrabbling around in the subatomic fog, really. But we just don't know how to think about it. I mean, if you took an absolutely just simply random interpretation of the outcome of measurement, then it would be the goddess Fortuna who decides what happens.
Thank you. Could you expand a little bit on why you think middle knowledge is incoherent? Why do you think that middle knowledge is incoherent?
Well, it seems, I'm not a philosopher, but it seems to me that to say that you can know, anyone can know, even God, can know beforehand what a free agent is going to do, is really saying there are, in those circumstances that the free agent faces, actually determining principles that bring about the choice of which the agent is unaware, but God can be aware. But if that's the case, then it doesn't seem to me it is truly a free action. I don't think modernism is very widely supported in theology.
Actually, I mean, what is a free action then, John?
Well, I'm a libertarian. I believe in the freedom of indifference. I believe that I can either choose coffee or tea. Now, if you're a compatibilist, all you require is that there is a consonance between desires and actions. I want to go through the door, I go through the door. But I think that's enough, not enough for true freedom. You could construct a robot, presumably, which when it was so programmed that when it went through the door, it said, I want to go through the door. But that would not be a freely acting robot. I don't think it's enough to establish the consonance so I'm an incompatibilist in relation to human freedom. Gosh, we have gone on some very wide-ranging things.
Philosophical questions too, yes, which are very relevant to this whole debate.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you.
Probably a really naive question, but if God doesn't know the future because it hasn't happened yet, then when Jesus was born, did he know that he would be resurrected?
I believe that Jesus trusted. You mean?
Did God know?
Did God know? Oh yes, because the resurrection is a great new act of God. I mean, God is. There is a kenosis of divine power, but it doesn't mean that God doesn't act in the world. I believe that God acts providentially with history and the unfolding character of open process. And I believe that God also, from time to time, does things that are inherently new. God is not condemned always to do the same thing. We speak of God in personal terms, calling God Father rather than a force, because we believe that God can do particular things in particular circumstances and can do exceptional things in exceptional circumstances. The problem of miracle is the problem of divine consistency. Not that God can never do something new, but that God is not a capricious conjurer who does a trick today that God didn't think about doing yesterday and won't be bothered to do tomorrow. And the easiest miracle of all to understand, it seems to me, is the resurrection. One can see the point of it, I think, pretty bluntly. You can see that here is a new situation. If the Word is incarnate in Jesus, suffers death upon the cross, that is an unprecedented situation. And God is perfectly consistent that God, through a great new act, the beginning of God's eschatological act of new creation, does something new. That God determined on the resurrection. I don't think Jesus, during his earthly ministry, knew exactly how it was going to happen. That's why I said he trusted in God to vindicate him. I think that I'm absolutely sure that's true. Whether he knew exactly the nature of the vindication, I'm not quite so sure.
Can I come back on that? I mean,
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So the resurrection depended on free agents putting Jesus to death in the first place. I mean, maybe they wouldn't have done, needn't have done.
Did God prompt Pilate? Did God prompt Judas to make the betrayal? Was it really such a...
Well, again, I think God sees the forces that are at work. I don't think that God saw exactly the words that Judas was going to, and what Jesus did, that Judas was going to speak to the high priest and so on. But God sees that there are God-resistant forces at work in the world, which are going to bring about the death of Jesus.
Hard to guarantee it, though. I mean,
What?
Hard to guarantee it. If Jesus was just born, to predict in 30 years' time, he'd necessarily be crucified or put to death. It's a big sort of take the risk, isn't it, on God's part? It might not have happened. Surely it wasn't that deterministic. Or did God sort of guide things a little bit?
Well, I think the interesting question to ask is what would happen if Jesus had died in infancy? Yeah. If he'd caught pneumonia and died at age 5, something like that, would the whole divine plan have been frustrated by that? That's tricky. I don't know how to. I do think that God interacts with the world, and so I think there is a degree of divine providential care that could have preserved Jesus from a premature death in that respect. These are highly speculative matters. All I'm wanting to argue in all these things is that there is a degree of room for manoeuvre. I'm not wanting to argue that I know the answers to exactly what God's plans are, exactly what God could do, but I don't think that we are forced into a situation where there is no divine option except to accept the premature death of the Son and try again later.
I think there's a very, if I can butt in on that, there's a very interesting passage in Plato's Republic where Plato speculates about what would happen to a completely just person. And I think he even talks about that person being crucified.
Oh, really?
Yes. Certainly it would be, the world could not tolerate.
I'm doubtful about that, but...
the world could not tolerate such goodness in a sense. And if Plato was able to speculate about that, then God would have fairly good knowledge about what would happen to the...
And of course it's reflected in the Hebrew scriptures and things like Isaiah 53, the suffering of the righteous servant and so on.
Well, there's the whole of the servant songs and the great question that the Ethiopian civil servant asks Philip, who is this writing about? Well, one answer that you can give to the question is, this is what happens when someone is a servant of God. This is this is the way the world works in that respect. In Jesus' case, you have the combination of the fact that that's the way the spiritual world works, the extraordinary sort of number of people around, as Peter brings out in his speech of Acts, plus, probably the most important fact of all, is the way that Jesus himself stays in control of what's happening throughout his final days leading up to his arrest and crucifixion.
What about the cry from the cross? What does it signify in this context? Sudden loss of...
Yeah, I mean there is a change, as we pointed out, there is a change in the gospel stories. During most of the gospel, the verbs used of Jesus are in the active voice, but when the passion narrative begins, they turn into the passive voice, and there is an acceptance of what's happening to him. And you see, I mean, there's a very profound Christian understanding that salvation comes through Jesus accepting the whole of human experience. He assumes all to redeem all, is the way that the Fathers express it. And the cry from the cross, it was incidentally, I mean, it says something, I think, about the truthful intent of the Gospel writers. Both Matthew and Mark record this. It's a very troubling, strange cry. Matthew, it's so strange that Mark has to record it in the Aramaic that presumably Jesus spoke. Matthew turns it into Hebrew, making it sound a little bit more like a liturgical remark, but there it is. And the paradox of the Passion, or one of the paradoxes of the cross, is that the incarnate God accepts on our behalf the human experience of God forsaking us. by that redeems it. I mean, it's very deep. I mean, Paul expresses it in a different way by saying he made him sin whom knew no sin. There's this feeling that Jesus' passion is the total embrace. See, one of the powerful things, I mean, we talked about a little bit about theodicy last night, and I gave the answer in terms of evolutionary process and all that, but, which is, I think, moderately helpful. But the deepest Christian answer to the problems of theodicy is actually the cross of Christ, because the Christian God is not a benevolent spectator, compassionate spectator, the suffering of the world, sitting up there invulnerable in heaven and saying, you know, my heart bleeds for you. But he has been a fellow sufferer who truly understands, to use a phrase of Whitehead, because he has lived a life, died a death, experienced God-forsakenness in the cross. And I think that's a very important part of the mystery of what's going on there.
I don't know, we've still got lots of questions to come. Please.
I just wanted to say I think we should be pretty cautious in the way we handle these things, because we know in physics that you can get into terrible trouble by trying to adopt two different frames of reference that are incompatible simultaneously. But we've been talking about ourselves and our point of view from in time in this universe, and suddenly we've been flipping and trying to say, what is God's point of view on the same phenomena? And I think that we probably don't know God's point of view. We can only talk about God's point of view as we receive it. So, yes, these are very interesting things, but the mystic in me begins to take over at this point.
Thank you. I think that's a very helpful remark to make. You're absolutely right. This is the moorings of apophatic theology, that we don't know what God is, we know what God is not. That's the best we can say. And it's always best to bear that in mind. But again, the Eastern Church has been much more aware of that. The Latin Church of the West, of which I imagine almost all of us here anyway are the heirs, has been rather rationally confident and likes to rattle on and talking about things. So I agree with all that. And what I've said is been speculative, contentious, quite a lot of it probably wrong, but I mean that's what I believe. Nevertheless, I think that we have to try and say something, because if we don't do that, it all seems mysterious, and particularly to perhaps our scientific colleagues, that you know, this is all just muddle thinking and whistling in the dark and things like that. You know, Augustine, when he wrote his great book on the Trinity, said 3 whats. He said, we say 3 persons because it is better to say something than to remain silent. And that's I think, so we're caught in a sort of trap, in a sort of complementary relationship of acknowledging our ignorance and finiteness and perplexity and things like that, but nevertheless trying to say something. I mean, lots of Christian people are going to disagree about a lot of these things. I mean, I'm sure lots of you don't agree with my view about God's relationship to time. But we have to just help each other and try and say what we find ourselves mildly illuminating.
Yeah, I would say exactly the same thing. I mean, my experience of students, a lot of students come to see me and they say, how can you, a professor of theoretical physics, be a Christian, you see? And then they trot out the usual standard sort of question. It must have stunned out, actually, it's listed rather well. But things like, what does God do in the world, is a very, very common question. And of course, you're right, it's totally speculative, but if you simply say, oh, it's all mystical, which I actually, personally, I'm inclined to agree with, but then they go away and think, well, it doesn't really know what he's talking about, he's just a bit, peculiar. So I think it's really true. But I think John's right, you have to say something, as long as it's not totally incoherent.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
That's a good point. Attempt. Well, just another comment on that, of course, a lot of times, of course, people say if we can't imagine something, then it must not be possible. So, I greatly value this debate, seeing the different viewpoints here, and whether or not either one or any of them, is absolutely right. It's very helpful to see there's this possible way of looking at that possible way, and it shows that at least some of the problems you maybe can overcome them by this way. Maybe this isn't the final answer, but to maybe show that there's not some foolproof argument against Christianity because nobody's thought of some possible way. So I think in that way it helps to see the variety of thoughts, even if we may disagree and don't have the final answer. So I really value the discussion.
Yes.
Is there a non-mystical interpretation for judgment? I mean, not necessarily in day of, but judgment in terms of karma, for example. Or
Judgment, yes, judgment.
Yeah.
Well, I think judgment is a very important concept, because I think the essence of judgment is not appearing before a rather testy sort of celestial Judge Jeffreys, who's pretty anxious to send you down as soon as possible. Judgment is actually coming to terms with reality, and it's going to be a painful process. And I think that what we're going to see, what is going to be shown to us, is what we actually are. And that, and a lot of illusions are going to be stripped away in relation to that. So that's what I think judgment is. It's the picture really that of judgment in John's Gospel, which is a sort of self-judgment in a way. This is the judgment that light came into the world, that people preferred darkness rather than light. But of course, reality is the only thing that we are able to come to terms with in the end, and therefore, in that sense, judgment is a hopeful word. It's not a. But it's going to be part of it. It seems to me, if we learn anything about God from the history of the present creation, we learn that God is patient and subtle, and works through process and not by magic. And I think that will be true of a life beyond this world. So the salvation is a salvific process in which we enter more and more clearly and openly into contact with the reality of God, and that will involve judgment and purgation. I think all going to drive with lots of dross in our lives has to be cleared away. So that's what's going to. But ultimately, if we are willing to accept God's love and mercy, ultimately that's a hopeful process.
I do wonder whether we. Maybe just one last one, because it is coffee time, but yeah. Go.
I was just going to say, one of the discussions we were having last night was it's kind of convenient and a good thing that we don't know all the details about how it works. By it I mean God's relationship with us, because, for example, if we were told that 50% go to heaven and 50% below, we would line ourselves up and say, well, I'm conveniently on this side of the border, so that's as far as I need to be, So it's good that we're sort of slightly in the dark. But I was wondering why you think it's important, or indeed why you think that God doesn't know us better than we know ourselves. Because I remember you were saying, in order for us to have, or it seemed to me you were saying that in order for us to be totally free agents, it means that God wouldn't know what we were going to do. Because I've always assumed that kind of God does know that the blunder I was about to make.
Well, I certainly think that God knows us better than we know ourselves. I mean, that's really what I've just been saying about judgment. I mean, we should be given, if you like, a God's eye view of ourselves rather than a self-congratulatory view of ourselves that we probably entertain most of the time. But I think there are some things that God cannot know. And I myself do think that God cannot know with absolute certainty the act of a free agent before that act takes place. God can see the forces that are at work influencing that person, can see the drift of their inclinations. But I think the action is genuinely free, and of course many of our actions are not as free as we suppose them to be. But if the action is genuinely free, then I think even God will not know it beforehand.
Well, I think that's a good ending to what has been a very interesting, lively debate, and I think we've heard a great deal of wisdom from our speakers, and I'd like to thank them very much.